ways on time is that you should begin on time. My apologies for the slight delay.
Apologies, I think we were just giving some space for the namaz. Salam, greetings, by way of gratitude. Gratitude to each one of you for being here with us to help celebrate the 25 years of the Mohata Palace Museum. By way of introduction, I am Saima Devi, additional curator here. Welcome to the fifth event of our distinguished lecture series titled The Hidden Caliphate Beyond the Oxus and the Indus, the multi-award winning book by Dr. Waleed Ziad. I'm fortunate to have Waleed as a friend, even a confidant, and to witness his spectacular trajectory over the last few years, well, several actually, and his continuous travels and research trips. In fact, he just returned from Iraq just yesterday. So, over to you, Waleed. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I am honored to be here, particularly privileged to be introduced by Salma Zaidi, who I am a great admirer of professionally, as an academic, as a practitioner, as a manager par excellence. I am so glad that you are here putting this together. And for all of you who are here, I want to thank you. It is an absolute pleasure to be invited here to speak about my book, Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and the Indus, which was published by Harvard a couple of years ago and will soon be available through Sangye Meal in Pakistan. This is a story that takes us across Asia, from Peshawar to Kabul to Russia to China. It's also a story that turns the colonial narrative on its head, makes us question everything that we've been told about the region in which we live. We were misled that before the British and the Russian arrival, Pakistan, certainly Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, very much Sindh, and Afghanistan and Central Asia at large, were these lands of lawlessness, separation, backwardness. It's sad how few of us today know that Peshawar was the college town par excellence prior to the British conquest, and that the great scholars of Siberia, Tatarstan, and Xinjiang got their diplomas from Peshawar's luminaries. This counter-history, which I'm going to tell today, slowly unfolded through about a decade of fieldwork. It often required going from village to village across Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, collecting rare primary sources and manuscripts in 7 languages. So I'll also be sharing quite a few photographs from my travels. There's going to be a bit of a show and tell component to this. Well after this book was complete, sources are still pouring in, and sources that still continue to amaze me. Now, before I begin, officially, I have to say I cannot take responsibility for what I'm about to present. There are hundreds of people who have guided me in these endeavors, and I'm not exaggerating here. Incredible generosity, people writing books about subjects where they've handed me primary sources, people I've never met before who've taken me miles and miles to find a single individual or a single source. I think above and beyond, I really want to give a special thanks to Dr. Iqbal Mujaddidi, who was the late Dr. Iqbal Mujaddidi, one of the finest minds and greatest hearts that I have encountered. Really makes me proud to be from here. And Kashifuddin Chauhan, who's actually been with me through a lot of my research. So, with that, this is our roadmap. I'm going to begin with a quick historical overview, and then we're going to move into the subjects of my book, the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufis. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why the story matters. Why should we care about this obscure period, obscure places? And then we'll move on to take a look at the book's protagonist, the Sufi saint Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, or Hazrat Jio Sahib, in two cities in Peshawar and in Bukhara, now in Uzbekistan, a figure who has just been beyond expectation. You'll hear about him soon. The story actually brings to light an intellectual, spiritual network that held together the social fabric of much of Asia, a network that is either not known or not spoken about, and certainly obliterated from the colonial and, of course, the modern nation-state narratives. I would argue perhaps deliberately. This is not the kind of story you're going to find in the Pakistan Studies textbook. Hopefully it should be, inshallah. Now, I'm going to take a moment to place us in the world we're about to enter. Let's begin with the two rivers. The Indus River. Hopefully everyone here knows the Indus River. The second is the Amu Darya, or the Oxus River. Moving away from the mic, roughly the border between modern-day Afghanistan and what was formerly Russian Central Asia. The story that I'm about to tell is set against the backdrop of some dramatic changes that occurred across Central Asia, Afghanistan, and South Asia in the 18th century. The three great empires, the Mughals, the Safavids in Iran, the Astrakhanids in Central Asia, the Uzbeks, they're breaking apart. And out of this chaos, a brilliant and ruthless, slightly problematic, Iranian soldier of fortune, Nadir Shah Afshar, carves out a vast empire from the Caucasus all the way to North India, and then in 1747, he dies, leaving an absolute vacuum. After this, bit by bit, a slew of new states gradually start emerging. We've got, once again, moving away from the mic, Shiraz in Iran. We've got Khiva, Bukhara in modern-day Uzbekistan, the Khalid Khan covering Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And in today's Pakistan, we have Bahawalpur, of course, Sindh, Lasbela, Ranjit Singh's Punjab being, of course, a very important one, and Galat, which of course pre-existed but takes on a slightly different form after Nadir Shah, and so on and so forth. But the most important of these states that emerges is actually built by Nadir Shah's Afghan commander, Ahmad Shah Abdali, fellow-born Multan, and this, of course, is the Durrani Empire, which in its height in 1760 stretches from Khorasan in Iran all the way to North India, with tenuous hold over Central Asia as well. It's an empire that lasts only a few generations. In fact, because of the British colonial narrative, we normally see it as an outside invasion. That's, by the way, this is one of the first problematic. I want you to hold on to this point here. Few people today realize the impact that the Durranis had on revitalizing the Muslim world. Now, this dynamic period also witnesses the growth of an intricate network of shrines, Sufi centers, and madrasas of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufi order. And I'll be shortening this to Mujaddidi. Now, just to get a sense of the audience, can I get a show of hands? How many people are familiar with the Mujaddidi Silsila or the Naqshbandiya? Okay. We do actually have a peer of one of the most important Mujaddidi institutions in our presence, with a library of 30,000 manuscripts. So I'm honored to be in his presence. Now, this order had originated some generations earlier with Sheikh Ahmad Sibhindi, who passed away in 1624. A Sufi known as the reviver, or in Arabic, the Mujaddid, of the second Islamic millennium. Hence, his followers are called the Mujaddidis. Among Sibhindi's many intellectual contributions was reconciling the Sufi path and Sharia into one cohesive system, demonstrating that the outer and the inner dimensions of Islam, that is Sharia and Sufism, could not exist without the other. He is one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented figures, especially in the colonial and post-colonial narratives. No, this man is not the progenitor of the Tunisian theory and a political figure. He is one of the most sophisticated minds of the 17th century, who actually comes up with also one of the most sophisticated modes of meditative practices and that energy transmission in the metaphysical human body. Now, the Mujaddid Sufis, let me just go back here. The successors of Sir Hindi were the most widespread Muslim network before the 20th century. Remarkably, they appear everywhere, at the helm of social and intellectual movements and occasionally rebellions, from Istanbul to Kurdistan to the Caucasus to Indonesia. As an aside, by the way, they have a very strong tradition of female religious leadership. To give a shout out to my upcoming book that I presented on last year here. As of 1800, the two biggest religious networks in the Durrani Empire, both Mujaddidi, are led by women, and also, in fact, in the Qazi Ahmad Lawani Sharif Silsila, there are several key figures, female leaders within the order. Now, the Mujaddidis had established a remarkable parallel form of popular leadership, which transcended and outlived the dynasties, that the noble houses that ruled over this region. They're still the most important networks in places like Afghanistan, Indonesia, and Turkey. My book, Hidden Caliphate, and this will make sense as we continue, essentially argues that the Mujaddidis are synthesizers. They brought together spaces and places and ideas, which we would assume to be unconnected, fusing Persian, Arabic, and vernacular literary traditions, mystical virtuosity, popular religious practices, and the world of the urban ulema and their scholarship into a unified yet flexible articulation of Islam. So this particular, we can call it, flavor of orthodoxy gave coherence to diverse Muslim communities across a vast territory. Now, for simplicity's sake, before I begin, I'm going to clarify some quick terms. Pir or Sheikh, of course, is the Sufi teacher, the Sufi guide. The Khalifa is the appointed deputy of the Sufi master with permission to guide her or his students. And the institutions that I'm going to talk about are the mosque, the madrasa, for teaching the outer sciences, whether law, mathematics, rhetoric, grammar, astronomy, so on and so forth, from where students go on to higher studies, so kind of a PhD program in the Khanaqah or the Dargah, which is the Sufi center for spiritual cleansing and the hidden sciences, like dhikr or muraqabah, which are forms of meditation. Now, why is the story I'm about to tell so important? Because it totally changes our conception of how the Muslim world worked before colonialism in 5 key ways. First, what it does is it overturns the byproduct of the colonial imagination, which is the decline narrative, the myth of social and intellectual breakdown within the Muslim world. We've all heard this, right? That there's a kind of rise somewhere about 950,000. Muslims are smart and they build astrolabs somewhere in Baghdad. No one knows astrolabs work. They like how they look. And then somehow there's a sort of decline throughout, and the Mughals and the Safavids are paradigmatic of this sort of like drunken, debauched decline. This is a political narrative. We need to push this aside. I, of course, focus here on Central and Southern Asia, where it's often assumed that before colonialism, these regions were isolated backwaters and the Khan dropped people off towers and so on and so forth. Now, let me be frank. The British great game travelers of the 19th century who came through Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan sold stories, much like many travelers today, of these regions as lands of ignorance, arbitrary violence, and barbarity, despite the fact that they were being treated with the utmost hospitality. So that's the irony. And of course, in these stories, they're the heroes wandering into the heart of darkness, and we still admire them and reprint their books in places like Pakistan. When we turn away from the colonial accounts and the court histories towards these Sufi networks, we see that despite political disillusion, this vast region remained culturally and intellectually integrated. And the Mujaddidi Sufis, in fact, play a critical role in sustaining a zone of exchange through texts, through education, through pilgrimage, and universally trusted models of authority. Again, hold on to this. They were seen as the honest brokers who tied together tribal areas, urban and rural spaces, and seemingly unconnected social movements across the continent. Point two, as a corollary to this book also breaks down the colonial geographic myth of Central Asia versus South Asia versus Inner Asia as separate entities. I argue it is all one zone. What most of us unfortunately don't realize is that South Asia is not some sort of natural entity, it's a colonial term. It basically means British India. Central Asia is not some united kind of land, it is Russian Turkestan. It is the lands that Russia took over. So the use of South Asia actually marginalizes everything west of the Indus, the fringes of British authority, and condemns places like Fatah, or Waziristan, let's say where the last chapter of the story takes place, to this ungovernable frontier status. We are perpetually afraid. And of course, it generates a reality, right? Fear always generates a reality. Now, as we'll see today, the Pakistan-Afghanistan border is not a frontier. It's a Silk Road highway. Peshawar is not a frontier town, neither is Kalat, until colonialism and the modern nation-state borders make them otherwise. Now, glamorizing the Northwest frontier as the Wild West, which we often tend to do, and Afghanistan has actually been disastrous to its self-image, totally obscuring its tremendous intellectual, economic, and cultural centrality. Now, to limit this region, let's say to South Asia, means that we miss out on all the northern and westward connectivity. We ignore, for example, the pivotal role that Bukhara plays in shaping the spiritual and intellectual life of the regions in today's Pakistan. And conversely, the role Multan plays in shaping Central Asia. Third point. This is a very, very different story of Pakistan and Afghanistan from what we're used to. Remarkably, the Durrani Afghan Empire and its chief cities, Peshawar, Kabul, Kandahar, were the pivot points of these trans-Asiatic networks, where a host of knowledge systems and scholastic networks and nationalities blended. This work is therefore essential in not only reframing our understanding of Pakistan and Afghanistan's history, but tracing how this region transformed from a cosmopolitan hub not long ago with a highly complex religious tradition into an isolated backwater in the 20th century. Fourth point. This book shatters the myth of the orthodox ulema versus the heterodox Sufi. These are two separate groups. One is conservative, one is liberal. They hate each other. One composes poetry, the other is all about law. Before the 20th century, the Sufis, the teachers of meditation and the writers of love poetry, the ulema, the professors of grammar, tafsir, astronomy, usul fiqh, and the ecstatic mystics were all one, inseparable, and overlapping. From a literary vantage point, they look different. When you go into their biographies, you realize that when they are manifesting themselves as the poet, there's a very different consciousness. As the jurist, there's a very different consciousness. As the wandering mystic, is yet another. It is not the world of madrasas on one side, Sufi centers on another, and wandering dervishes kind of doing their thing. The Mujaddidis and their contemporaries integrate all of these, which makes them such potent agents of revival and connectivity. Every alim was a Sufi practitioner, Sufis had to abide by Sharia, jurists had to internally purify themselves. Now, point 5. Most importantly, this book offers a very new understanding of sovereignty in the Muslim world, of the practical relationship between the state, the subjects, and the religious sphere of mystics and scholars. Now, I argue that Muslims understood authority structures within a two-tiered paradigm, and I hope that many of you recognize this, because it's obvious. The Zahiri, the manifest, and the Batini, the hidden caliphates. So in this hierarchical model, which draws from terms used by Sufis themselves, famously Shah Waliullah, that Nabi of the 18th century, and many, many more, the hidden caliphate of Sufi scholastic networks maintains a trans-regional balance, positioned above a manifest caliphate, which was the political authority in the 18th century made up of all of these fracturing states that lasted about 50, 60 years, so on and so forth. The scholar Sufis provide a mix of social welfare services, scholastic services, popular leadership, ethical guidance. They are the shrinks, medical and psychological counseling services, mediation, trade, literary and even diplomatic services between warring states. They could even raise defensive irregular armies, in fact, really almost impossible to defeat defensive armies when required for First and Second Anglo-Afghan War. Or they could theologically challenge dangerous ideologies threatening Islam from within, particularly Wahhabism. Before colonialism, state elites and subjects required this umbrella to sustain an interconnected world order. The urbanites and the agriculturalists, the petty princes, the tribal chiefs, and the landed gentry alike relied on this overarching Sufi network for stability, for communication, and mediation, both between competing parties and between the visible and invisible realms. And that is the main take-home of the book. Now, there are a few things I do in this book that are a little bit different. So first, rather than focusing on one figure or one place to understand these Sufis, I chose one Mujaddidi lineage, one of several hundreds of thousands, one chain, a silsila, and physically followed the careers of members of this lineage across generations, across South and Central Asia and the steppes. The lineage that I chose was that of a fascinating 18th century Mujaddidi scholar saint, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad of Peshawar. Back then, of course, a bustling Durrani metropolis. What drew me to this figure is that he is completely forgotten today. In fact, I challenge you to go to Peshawar or even go to Yatatul, where he's buried, and ask about his shrine. If you go to his shrine, ask about who he is, and you'll get a sense, in fact, of how unknown he is. Yet he and his descendants end up being connected to almost every major Muslim social movement from India to Siberia, attracting followers from faqirs and celebrated scholars to Afghan kings and at least 5 rulers of Central Asia. So the book ends up being structured as a transgenerational travelogue of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad and his students, somewhat mirroring my own voyage. Starting from Sirhind in North India, back there, moving on to Peshawar, to Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan, into Bukhara, Tatarstan, and the steppes, to Fatah, which was a very important kind of rising kingdom in the 18th century, bordering China and Russia and Bukhara, and into Xinjiang in China, and finally to the great caravan routes, ending in the ungovernable Afghan tribal heartlands. In fact, the last chapter is North Waziristan. Now, half the fun has actually been, admittedly, the journey itself. Encountering an array of sources. By the way, this is one of my favorite, because each of these regions give you a very, very different set of sources. You almost get a different angle with which to view this. You're almost forced into different angles. So it could be the built environment, right? The very streets, the buildings. It could be biographies, it could be tracts on cosmology, meditation handbooks. In fact, there's one whole chapter on handbooks of meditation here. Polemics in Persian, Arabic, Chagatai, Uyghur, Tatar, Urdu, Pashto, so on and so forth. And again, because of the varied sources in each region, each location, each chapter ends up telling a very different story, revealing different dimensions of how the Sufis were able to penetrate into such very sacred landscapes. All right, with that very, very long introduction. I'm now going to walk us through the story of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, who's the protagonist of the book. Now, there's going to be a lot of information here. Bear with me. Here are the key take-homes. Connectivity amidst political fracturing. The fracturing of the Mughals and the other empires was not a period of civilizational decline, but incredible intellectual exchange. The story also offers a peek into the rich, multifaceted world of the 18th, 19th century Sufi scholar. I'm going to inundate all of us with details today. I apologize in advance. So we can get a real sense of how these networks functioned and flourished. So bear with me as we begin the journey. Now, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad was born in 1743 into Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's family, who was the founder of the Mujahidi order, and he was a byproduct of the academically and spiritually active world of Mughal Sirhind, the Darul Shah, as it was called. It was a cosmopolitan town on the Lahore-Delhi highway. It hosted an academic complex where generations of Sufis and scholars visited and resided. These Sufis wrote hundreds of books, synthesizing multiple intellectual traditions, whether meditative and reading sciences, channeling energy through points on the metaphysical human body, or fiqh, hadith, and tafsir. For 24 years, we are told, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad studied the revealed and rational sciences and received intensive training in Sufi practices. He attained teaching diplomas, and then he taught for several years at the center in Sirhind. Then all of a sudden you've got these invasions that hit North India in the mid-18th century. So the Mujahidi Sufis start leaving Sirhind. Many of them are welcome in the new Durrani Empire. Fazl Ahmad in the 1760s migrates to Peshawar and sets himself up in a humble mosque where he earns a reputation by supplying vast quantities of free bread to the people during a harsh drought. Mobilizing resources is a big part of what they do. His circle of disciples grows exponentially, and eventually he sets up an independent Sufi center. It's still there, bit by bit being encroached upon, in a neighborhood which came to be known by his son's name, Fazl Haq, and which is still called Fazl Haq. Now, soon after, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad embarks upon the first of 5 epic journeys to Bukhara via Kabul, establishing Sufi communities en route. In Bukhara, he establishes a Sufi center where the celebrated state builder of Bukhara, the King Shah Murad, and his son, and numerous scholars and nobility become his devoted disciples. Now, contemporary sources tell us that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's disciples numbered in the thousands on both sides of the Oxus River, and that he appointed over 600 Khalifas. It's not an exaggeration. I've actually found about 115 names in contemporary biographies, and I keep discovering new ones. Now, the Khalifas included some of the leading Quranic commentators, mystical poets, specialists on Rumi's Masnavi, from the Ottoman lands to Dagestan and the Caucasus in Russia, to Kyrgyzstan, to Punjab. Now, it's rather exciting, this is a bit of an aside. Having done so much work on the Central Asian front, finally last summer I had the honor of visiting 2 of the dargahs in Punjab. And just to give you a sense of the diversity, one of the Khalifa was among the most respected qazis or judges in Pothohar. The family still has 2 vast manuscript collections, and in fact, the gentleman who's currently presiding over is writing a 4-volume history of the lineage. Again, wonderful human being. Another near Sargodha, in fact near the largest banyan tree in Pakistan, the remarkable Julay Shah, a powerful ecstatic mystic who controlled jinns. Qazi, ecstatic mystic, just keep in mind. Now, this is Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's travel route, and all the regions listed are areas with either a Sufi center or khulafa or a concentration of disciples. Often, Khalifas were appointed to teach in their place of origin, but several from the Mughal and Durrani territories were appointed in Central Asia's chief cities. So, in particularly high demand were the scholars of Sialkot and Wazirabad. Does that surprise anyone here? Okay. In case you didn't know, Sialkot is not just a place where soccer balls are made. Do a Google search on Abdul Hakim Sialkoti and you will understand. Ulama Iqbal and Faiz did not come out of thin air. We often assume that all of these figures, including Abdul Latif Bidai, is coming out of thin air. He's inspired, he wanders, and he gets these. They are coming from very, very strong institutional structures and traditions of scholarship that they're building upon. And in fact, it's injustice to sort of reduce them to these sort of inspired figures. So, Sialkot, in case you didn't know, was one of the chief Mughal scholastic centers and the capital of 2 ancient empires, Sakala. One of the Wazirabadi Khulafa, within several years of his arrival in Samarkand, becomes the revered Samarkandi saint and scholar known as La'ambek Samarkandi. Now, most of the stories follow this pattern. Mobility was remarkably easy, and of course everyone knows Persian. So the principal centers are here. They're in, obviously, Peshawar. We've got Bukhara, and then we've got Aqsa, which is near the Afghan-Uzbek border. In addition to many others established by Khulafa, which then become hubs for sub-networks. So, for example, his son in Bukhara appointed Khalifas into Tatarstan and Siberia and Tashkent. And then another Khalifa, for example, Imam Raza Zakori, this is Deir Ismail Khan, appointed Khalifas across today's Pakistan-Afghanistan tribal border. So let me give you a sense of how these networks were constructed and what was going on here. Let me just consider, as an urban scholar, how would you function in a region with a different language and a completely different social structure? So let's consider the example of Imam Raza Zakori. He belonged to a locally venerated, tribe-based saintly family, tied to the Miakhel Afghan tribe of Goendas. Alright, so what does this mean? These are essentially Afghan tribes who migrate twice a year. There's a great migration route at them. Okay, it's far off the map here, so I won't even bother pointing, but from the steppes down to Bukhara, you're carrying horses from Bukhara all the way down through Afghanistan into Deir Ismail Ghazni, Deir Ismail Khan, and then upwards up the Indus into the in fact, Hazara territories. And then what they do is they stop in various places for agriculture along the way. So this is a remarkably different environment as compared to urban centers like Bukhara or Delhi. Now, for one, while Fazl Ahmad's urban disciples were often accomplished scholars, Imam Raza grew up a goat herd and he was illiterate. His world was one of fantastical miracles. Interwoven with the perils and the opportunities of the caravan journey and its natural environment. Wild animals came to their zikr. He once risked his life to save wild puppies. It's a fantastic story. Once while on a caravan journey, at night they're roaming in the wilderness and a female dog comes to him and utters something, and he realizes that she needs help. So then he follows her into the darkness, and everyone in the caravan says, "You're insane. You're gonna die." So he says, "Okay, if I don't come back in the morning, just pray my funerary prayers." So he follows this dog, and it turns out her puppies are hungry, and he has no food, so he regurgitates what he has, and whatever water he has, he gives to the puppies. And this actually is the experience that grants him sainthood. This is the actual transformative experience in his life. This is a much older trope within the Naqshbandi order, with Fajr Naqshbandi as well, who takes care of the feral dogs of Bukhara. Now, when Imam Raza became Fazl Ahmad's Khalifa, there emerged a synergetic relationship. Imam Raza brought to the table the respect of his family among the nomadic tribes and their shrines across the great caravan routes, while Fazl Ahmad offered what we may call institutional capacity, links to the trans-Asiatic Sufi and Madrasa networks and their knowledge systems. Within one generation, we find Imam Raza's sons composing sophisticated tracts, legal and theological, in fact, two big ones on combating Wahhabism, which cite over 100 classical works which are now hosted at their center in this little village on the nomadic routes. We find, as you can see on this side, the Divan office, on the tombstones at Zakori. So these are the institutions where the urban domain meets the pastoral nomadic, the tribal. Now, other Khalifas belong to older established Sufi lineages. Fazl Ahmad's principal biography was written by a Khalifa at Mazar-e-Sharif, who was the brother of the Khadim of Mazar-e-Sharif, which is a shrine city in northern Afghanistan. And I should ask, does everyone know who's buried here? It's, yes. Yeah, so Sayyidina Imam Ali is believed to be buried there. There are two main locations, there are a few secondary ones as well. So this is actually the most important shrine state and sacred nucleus of Central Asia, and the Khadims are the de facto governors of the state, and they are, well, one of them is a biographer. And she's a phenomenal writer. It's one of the best biographies of the early 19th century that I've looked at. Now, As a prelude to discussing Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's career in Peshawar and Bukhara, I want to present a glimpse into a vast topic. His teachings following certainty stress the interdependence of Sufism and Sharia. His disciples have very fortunately left us with very detailed first-hand accounts of his day, which reflect his ethos, and apologize in advance for the small print. He led a highly disciplined life, both ascetic and practical. As you can see up here, he's teaching meditation, group meditation, personalized meditation, teaching fiqh, teaching hadith, teaching the collected works or collected letters of Shaykh Ahmad Sindhi, and pursuing his own spiritual practices, and then managing the day-to-day affairs of the community, and you'll see what they entail very soon. By the way, he sleeps only 4 hours during the day. There's actually a very well-documented practice of reducing sleep and being able to sort of then parse it out at various stages, presumably to make better use of the day. Now, his most reproduced work is just a 10-page handbook, and I got hold of about 20 different like manuscripts of this from really Tashkent and China all the way down to North India. So there's a chapter on this, and this is actually what we call a teacher's manual. It summarizes some of the points on Sufi practice. What's remarkable about this, and if you ever get the chance to look at this whole genre, is the practical way in which he presents Sufi knowledge to explain to students what they should expect in the Mujaddidi Sufi path and the core practices of the curriculum. So, for example, how do you take initiation? How do you energize your lataif? These are to attain spiritual states. These are subtle metaphysical points mapped onto the human body, which are kind of energized. It's almost as if like there's switches you turn on to receive certain energies that otherwise you are not attuned to receive. And then once you energize all of them, then the spiritual growth begins in about sort of 50 plus stages. They're a little bit like chakras, but according to Quranic principles and certain, let's say, terminology within the Sunnah. Does anyone here know? It's funny that I'm drawing these parallels. Gurdjieff, what's it the thing called? The circle thing, the enneagram. Now it's this bizarro personality test that people do. Well, Gurdjieff actually got his, for those who know, got sort of the mystery of the subtle points from this particular system in Pakistan. So, random aside, I apologize if I lost you in that. Now, he's also got in this book a comparative analysis of the benefits of channeling the breath and meditation within the Qadri, Sahrawardi, Chishti, and the Naqshbandi orders. It's a fascinating text because it gives you a sense of the degree to which spiritual practice had become so systematized. It was an empirical science. The spiritual practices he lays out are so systematic that he points out by the third 40-day chilla, a good student should reach the station of fana al-qalb, the annihilation of the heart. And if they don't, try this. If not, there's another trick you can use. In summary, the teachings reflect a philosophy in which energizing subtle centers on the metaphysical body coexist with jurisprudence and scriptural study, and in fact cannot be removed from jurisprudence and scriptural study. All right, now, let's turn to Peshawar to explore how its distinctive position during the Durrani Empire, so about, let's say, 1750 to roughly 1800, allowed it to host a spiritual scholastic infrastructure where ideas could develop and then travel onwards to China, Russia, and Central Asia. Now, in the latter 1700s, the Peshawar Valley is actually a great beneficiary of the chaos in North India. Whole set of scholars and Sufis and artists and so on and so forth end up actually migrating to Kabul, Peshawar, Kashmir, elsewhere in the empire. And the dual capitals, Peshawar and Kabul, profited from a enhanced trade, which ends up going all the way to St. Petersburg. By the 18th century trade, this is also an aside, is probably more, it's heavier in terms of actual, let's say, monetary amounts than the sea trade of the 16th century. There's a vast overland trade going from St. Petersburg through the Afghan Empire and then deeper into southern Asia. So what does this mean? It means that land grants and to Sufis and the ulama increase considerably. Now, the result ends up being a close-knit web of Sufi orders whose disciples set up madrasas and Sufi centers, providing education and social services, where a range of regional philosophies and pedagogies coalesce, ready for onward travel to Inner-Asia's open markets. Now, this is a very, very kind of brief cross-section of some of the principal Mujaddidi and Qadri lineages of Peshawar. Many of these are very famous figures, anti-colonial revolutionaries, activists, and they're all interconnected. So, again, for those who know Peshawar, these are the Hazrat Peshawar Bazaar. It's probably one of the two most important Sufi lineages in Afghanistan. They were, in fact, led the Mujahideen forces in the Soviet-Afghan War. Another one over there you can see is Pir Omar Chamkani, 30,000 acres around Peshawar, Bajor Dir, making it the largest charitable endowment in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa until Ayub Khan's time. Remarkably, by the way, both of these two orders, the largest, in fact, Pir Omar is the one who gives Ahmad Shah Abdali the go-ahead to take Hindustan. It's a really, really interesting story. But both of these orders are actually led by women as of 1800 to about 18, well, Chamkani 1800 to about 1805 to about 1850. We've also got Sheikh Junaid Peshawari, and for those who know Akhund the Swat, does that mean anything to Sadhu Baba? He's, can I just get a show of hands? Is it Sadhu Baba Akhund the Swat? Is he a well-known figure? Okay, so sort of 50-50, I guess. I'd recommend looking at him. He's one of the most famous anti-colonial mujahids. Incredible life story. He even sets up a state which actually becomes the Riyasat Swat, the Waleed Ziad's ancestor. It's actually a Sufi-based state. It's a kind of state where a whole group of different warring factions come together in a new sort of political experiment. Now, Edward Lear has this poem, Who, Which, Where, What is the Akhund Swat? Okay. So the British sources couldn't make head or tail of him, which is rather fascinating. All right, so now the Mujahideen Sufis also play critical roles in providing coherence to a region where governance was highly decentralized. A well-known archaeologist and adventurer, Charles Mason, he's also a deserter from the British Army, mentions in his notes that certain caravans, in fact all caravans, through the Khyber Pass would be accompanied by Sufis who, respected by tribal authorities, could negotiate tolls along the way. And there were certain routes, in fact, Mansour Elphinson says this, that could only be traversed by Sufis. So Hazrat Fazl Ahmad managed a vigorous trade network. Elites from Peshawar to Bukhara provided him with land grants and mills, and along with trade, this actually finances the centers. He's got a network of individuals, including a Hindu merchant from the banking capital of Shikarpur, who were designated as intermediaries and who could actually move the capital. Now, indeed, when two of the most infamous European agents and explorers, William Moorcroft and Alexander Burns, required safe passage into Central Asia, they were referred to Fazl Ahmad's son, Hazrat Fazl Haq, on account of the fact that the rulers of 5 Central Asian kingdoms were his disciples. The William Moorcroft episode is a remarkable example of the mechanics of the Mujahideen network and its transactional economy, so bear with me for 1 minute. In the 1820s, William Moorcroft, young fellow, ostensibly in search of horses, needs access to Bukhara. His secretary, a certain Mir Zatullah, who is himself a Mujahidi, suggests that he approach a certain Shah Niaz. Shah Niaz is originally from Tashkent, Takrur's family of Tashkent, and then moves to Kashmir, becomes a Mujaddidi Sufi, and then somehow ends up in Buddhist-controlled Ladakh. As it happens, Shah Niaz lost his Kashmiri properties after Ranjit Singh's occupation, and then he became somewhat of a kind of best friend and confidant to the Buddhist ruler of Ladakh. There are a lot of Naqshbandi Buddhist connections. As an aside, I don't know if you know, for 150 years, Xinjiang was actually ruled by a Naqshbandi Sufi dynasty, and the entire military bureaucratic elite were Jungars were the last great Buddhist nomadic empire. So they've got a long sort of relationship. And keep in mind that Nakshbandis are always considered like the kind of exemplars of orthodoxy. So that should also make you think a little bit about what we've been told and ways to conceptualize the past. All right, anyway, back to the story. So you've got Shah Niaz, who loses his territories in Kashmir. And at Ladakh, Shah Niaz graciously offers to refer Moorcroft to Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar, who he said may be able to give him a hand on the journey. So Moorcroft travels all the way down into Peshawar and meets Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son, Hazrat Fazl Haq, and he, in fact, what he does is he tells Shah Niaz, so Shah Niaz, his lands are taken by Ranjit Singh. Moorcroft tells him that he knows Ranjit Singh and he can maybe arrange a return of the lands, and Moorcroft manages to do that. So when he gets to Peshawar, he meets Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son, who, as it happened, needed to go to Bukhara to meet with the ruler, his disciple, Amir Haydar. So Moorcroft offers to finance the journey in return for good references along the way to the kings of Central Asia. Fazl Ahmad's son agrees. However, due to some miscommunication and definitely some mischief, Moorcroft ends up getting detained in the kingdom of Qunduz, which is Badakhshan and Khulm, it's somewhere between the two. Now, eventually through Fazl Ahmad's network, he was referred to a Mujaddidi Sufi of Qunduz, who had local clout with the ruler of Qunduz and was also his father-in-law, and then manages to negotiate his release. So this is a startling and very direct example of how these networks hold together the fabric of society. Now, such diplomatic services obviously went far beyond helping out kind of no-name adventurers. And the shrines and the Sufi centers in this network actually become safe houses and neutral spaces for political negotiation. This is the historical concept of bast. You've got two tribes that are warring. Prince gets held captive. Before hell breaks loose, he will take refuge in a Sufi center. It gives you a cushion, enough time to actually negotiate, figure out what to do, and then the war may go on, or perhaps peace ensues. And then Sufi ends up playing a major role in actually negotiating the peace. So, this neutrality, by the way, is enshrined within the Mujaddidi's own written tradition. One rarely finds a critique of any other religious denominations except Wahhabis. We'll get into this in a second. So as an example, one of Fazl Ahmad's trusted khulafa left us in a manuscript form, something I found